In 1981, Pastor David Richardson and his 7-year-old daughter Hannah vanished without a trace after Sunday evening service at Grace Baptist Church in rural Tennessee, leaving behind a congregation in shock and a mystery that would haunt the small mountain town for decades. But 26 years later, when excavators broke ground to expand the church basement, they uncovered something so horrifying beneath the sanctuary floor that it would shatter everything the community believed about faith, trust, and the man they had once called their shepherd. Detective Sarah Chen pulled her sedan into the gravel parking lot of Grace Baptist Church on a cold February morning in 2007, steam rising from her coffee cup as she surveyed the scene before her. The white wooden structure, with its modest steeple and hand-painted sign, looked exactly like countless other rural churches scattered across the Tennessee mountains. But today, yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the winter wind, and the peaceful sanctuary had become the center of the most disturbing case Chen had encountered in her 15 years with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. The call had come at dawn. Construction workers expanding the church basement had broken through what they thought was an old foundation wall, only to discover a hidden chamber beneath the altar. What they found inside that sealed space would require forensic teams, trauma, counselors, and a level of investigation that this quiet mountain community had never seen. Chen stepped out of her car, her breath visible in the crisp morning air, and approached the construction foreman who stood near a pile of excavated concrete and timber. His face was pale, his hands still trembling slightly as he pointed toward the gaping hole in the ground. "Ma'am, I've been doing construction for 30 years, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen anything like what's down there. We thought we were just breaking through to expand the foundation, but when we cleared away the debris..." Chen followed his gaze to where forensic technicians in white coveralls were carefully documenting the scene. Portable floodlights illuminated the excavated area, casting harsh shadows across what had once been holy ground. The hole was approximately 8 feet deep and 12 feet wide, carved directly beneath where the altar would have stood during Sunday services. But it wasn't the size of the chamber that had shaken the construction crew. It was what lay at the bottom, carefully wrapped in what appeared to be black plastic garbage bags, arranged in a pattern that suggested deliberate placement rather than hasty disposal. The forensic team had counted at least 4 distinct shapes, each bag sealed and positioned with an almost ritualistic precision. "How long has this church been here?" Chen asked, pulling out her notebook. "Built in 1963, the foreman replied. "The Richardson family helped establish it. Pastor David Richardson served here until he and his little girl disappeared back in 81. Nobody ever knew what happened to them." Chen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. She had read the cold case file during her drive from Nashville, familiarizing herself with the details of a mystery that had puzzled local law enforcement for over 2 decades. Pastor David Richardson, beloved by his congregation, had simply vanished along with his daughter Hannah after what witnesses described as a perfectly normal Sunday evening service. Their car was found abandoned 3 days later on a mountain road 20 miles away, but despite extensive searches, no trace of father or daughter had ever been found. Until now. Dr. Amanda Foster, the state's chief forensic pathologist, emerged from the excavation site and approached Chen with a grim expression. Her usually pristine lab coat was dusty, and her face bore the weight of preliminary findings that clearly disturbed her. "Sarah," Dr. Foster said quietly, "we need to talk. What we're dealing with here, it's not what anyone expected when this case was reopened." Chen followed the pathologist to a makeshift command tent that had been erected near the church entrance. Inside, photographs from the excavation site were spread across a folding table, each image more disturbing than the last. The plastic bags had been carefully opened, revealing remains that told a story of systematic concealment spanning decades. The first bag contained the skeletal remains of an adult male, approximately 40 years of age, Dr. Foster explained, pointing to a series of photographs. Based on preliminary examination and clothing fragments, this could very well be Pastor Richardson. But Sarah, that's just the beginning. Chen studied the images, noting the careful way the remains had been wrapped and positioned. "What do you mean?" "We found 4 bags total. The second contains the remains of a child, female, approximately 7 years old. The third? Dr. Foster paused, her professional composure wavering slightly. The third and fourth bags contained 2 more children, both appearing to be between the ages of 6 and 10. The words hung in the air like a physical weight. Chen set down her coffee cup with trembling hands, realizing that what they had uncovered was far more complex and horrifying than a simple missing persons case. This wasn't just about Pastor Richardson and Hannah. This was evidence of something much darker, something that had been hidden beneath the sanctuary floor for over a quarter century. There's something else, Dr. Foster continued, her voice barely audible above the sound of equipment outside. The way these remains were positioned, the ritual-like arrangement, someone didn't just dispose of these bodies, Sarah. Someone created a shrine. 26 years earlier, on a warm September evening in 1981, Pastor David Richardson stood at the pulpit of Grace Baptist Church, delivering what would unknowingly become his final sermon to a congregation of 37 faithful members. The setting sun streamed through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the wooden pews where families sat in their Sunday best, unaware that they were witnessing the last moments of a man who had devoted his life to their spiritual guidance. Dorothy Fleming, now 73 and one of the few remaining members from that time, sat in her kitchen with Detective Chen, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of chamomile tea. The morning's discovery at the church had shaken the entire community, but Dorothy had insisted on speaking with the detective immediately, claiming she had information that might be crucial to understanding what had happened that September night. Pastor, David was different that last Sunday, Dorothy said, her voice trembling with the weight of memories she had carried for decades. I'd been attending Grace Baptist since the day it opened, and I'd never seen him like that before. He kept looking toward the back of the church during his sermon, as if he was expecting someone, or maybe watching for something. Chen leaned forward, her pen poised over her notebook. Different how, Mrs. Fleming? Can you be more specific? Dorothy's eyes grew distant as she recalled that evening. He was nervous, kept stumbling over words he'd preached 100 times before, and little Hannah, she was sitting in the front pew like always, but she seemed restless too. Usually that child was quiet as a mouse during service, but that night she kept turning around, following her daddy's gaze to the back of the sanctuary. The elderly woman paused to sip her tea, her hands shaking slightly. After the service ended, Pastor David didn't do his usual greeting at the door. Instead, he asked me and the other deacons to stay behind for what he called an urgent church meeting. But when we gathered in the fellowship hall, he never showed up. Chen made notes, trying to piece together the timeline. According to the original police reports, Pastor Richardson and Hannah were last seen leaving the church around 8:30 that evening. Their car, a blue 1978 Ford sedan, was discovered 3 days later on Copper Ridge Road, doors unlocked, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of struggle. Mrs. Fleming, was there anyone new in the congregation that night? Any strangers or visitors who might have made Pastor Richardson uncomfortable? Dorothy's expression darkened, and she set down her teacup with a soft clink. There was someone, actually, a man I'd never seen before, sitting alone in the very back pew. He arrived after service had already started, which was unusual for our little church. Everyone knew everyone in those days. She closed her eyes, concentrating on the memory. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark suit. What struck me as odd was that he didn't participate in any of the service. Didn't sing the hymns, didn't bow his head during prayer, didn't even open a Bible. He just sat there watching Pastor David with this intense stare. Chen felt a chill run down her spine. Did you mention this man to the police when they investigated the disappearance? I tried to, Dorothy replied, frustration evident in her voice. But Sheriff Garrett back then, he was more interested in the theory that Pastor David had run off with church funds or gotten involved in some kind of scandal. The idea that our pastor might have been targeted by a stranger seemed far-fetched to him. The detective made a note to review the original case files more thoroughly. Small-town investigations in 1981 wouldn't have had the resources or expertise to properly handle what was clearly a complex case. Tell me about the church funds, Chen said. Was there any truth to those rumors? Dorothy's face flushed with indignation. Absolutely not. Pastor David was the most honest man I've ever known. He barely took enough salary to support himself and Hannah after his wife died. If anything, he was putting his own money into the church to help struggling families in the congregation. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. But there was something else, Detective Chen. Something I never told anyone because I wasn't sure what it meant at the time. Chen waited, sensing that whatever Dorothy was about to reveal could be significant. About a week before that last Sunday, Pastor David asked me to help him move some boxes from his office to his car. He said he was taking old church records to be stored at his house for safekeeping. But when I helped him carry those boxes, they were heavy, and one of them had a corner that had come loose. Dorothy paused, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her napkin. I accidentally saw inside, Detective. It wasn't church records at all. It was filled with photographs, dozens of them, and newspaper clippings. I only caught a glimpse, but what I saw, she shuddered. They were pictures of children, missing children from all over Tennessee and Kentucky. And the newspaper articles were all about unsolved disappearances going back years. The revelation hit Chen like a physical blow. Pastor Richardson hadn't just been a random victim. He had been investigating something, tracking patterns that had put him in danger. Mrs. Fleming, do you have any idea what happened to those boxes? They were never found, Dorothy replied sadly. When the police searched Pastor David's house after he disappeared, there was no sign of any boxes or photographs. It was as if someone had been there first, cleaning out anything that might have been important. As Chen drove away from Dorothy, Fleming's house, her mind raced with new possibilities. The discovery beneath the church wasn't just about Pastor Richardson and Hannah. It was connected to a larger pattern of missing children, and somehow Pastor David had stumbled onto something that had cost him and his daughter their lives. The forensic excavation at Grace Baptist Church continued through the afternoon, each layer of soil and debris revealing more disturbing details about what had been hidden beneath the sanctuary for over 2 decades. Detective Chen stood at the edge of the excavation site, watching as Dr. Foster and her team meticulously documented every aspect of the underground chamber that had been concealed directly below where countless Sunday services had taken place. The chamber itself was not a natural formation. Someone had deliberately excavated the space, reinforcing the walls with concrete blocks and creating what appeared to be a purposeful burial vault. The precision of the construction suggested extensive planning and construction knowledge, not the hasty work of someone trying to quickly dispose of evidence. Sarah, you need to see this, Dr. Foster called from the bottom of the excavation. She was kneeling beside the remains that had been carefully removed from the black plastic bags, her voice carrying a tone of controlled urgency that Chen had learned to recognize as significant. Chen descended into the chamber using the aluminum ladder the forensic team had positioned. The space was larger than it had appeared from above, approximately 12 feet long, 8 feet wide, and nearly 8 feet deep. The walls showed signs of careful waterproofing, and the floor had been lined with what appeared to be industrial plastic sheeting. What am I looking at? Chen asked, approaching the examination area where Dr. Foster had laid out the remains on sterile tarps. Evidence of systematic preservation, Dr. Foster replied, pointing to the skeletal remains with a gloved finger. These bodies weren't just hidden, Sarah. They were prepared for long-term storage. Look at this. She indicated the plastic wrapping that had contained each set of remains. This isn't ordinary garbage bags. This is heavy-duty contractor plastic, the kind used for hazardous material containment. And see these markings on the bones? Chen leaned closer, noting faint chemical stains on several of the larger bones. Chemical treatment? Lime powder, Dr. Foster confirmed. Applied post-mortem to accelerate decomposition while preventing odor. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This level of preparation suggests medical or mortuary knowledge. The implication sent a chill through Chen's body. This wasn't the work of someone acting in a moment of passion or panic. This was calculated, methodical, and indicated a level of premeditation that suggested multiple victims over an extended period. There's something else, Dr. Foster continued, moving to a section of the chamber wall. We found this embedded in the concrete. She pointed to what appeared to be a metal box, approximately the size of a shoebox, that had been built into the wall during construction. The forensic team had carefully extracted it, and it now sat on a separate examination table, its rusted, metal surface bearing a simple padlock that had long since corroded. "Have you opened it?" Chen asked. "Waiting for you," Dr. Foster replied. "But based on the weight and the way it rattles when moved, there's definitely something inside." Chen pulled on latex gloves and carefully lifted the box. The metal was cold and surprisingly heavy, and she could indeed hear objects shifting inside when she moved it. The padlock fell away with minimal pressure, its mechanism destroyed by decades of moisture and rust. Inside the box, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic, were items that made Chen's stomach drop. Dozens of Polaroid photographs, each showing children in various states of distress. Driver's licenses and identification cards bearing names that Chen recognized from missing persons. Reports spanning multiple states. And at the bottom of the box, a leather-bound journal filled with meticulous handwriting in black ink. Chen opened the journal carefully, her hands trembling as she read the first entry. September 15th, 1979. Acquired subject number 1. Female, age 8. From Copper Ridge Campground. Initial resistance minimal. Storage preparation complete. The entries continued chronologically, each one documenting what appeared to be the abduction, captivity, and eventual murder of children across Tennessee, Kentucky, and surrounding states. The handwriting was neat, clinical, almost medical in its detached description of horrific acts. "Sarah," Dr. Foster said quietly, "look at the final entry." Chen flipped to the last written page, dated September 20th, 1981, just days before Pastor Richardson's disappearance. Subject number 17, male interference detected. Pastor conducting unauthorized investigation. Immediate action required to protect operation. Hannah R., age 7. Acquisition opportunity presents itself. 2 problems, 1 solution. The journal slipped from Chen's hands, landing on the plastic tarp with a soft thud. Pastor Richardson hadn't been killed because he had stumbled onto something by accident. He had been systematically investigating a child abduction ring, and his daughter Hannah had been taken not as collateral damage, but as a deliberate act of both punishment and opportunity. "We're dealing with someone who treated this like a business," Chen said, her voice barely audible in the confines of the underground chamber. "Someone who saw children as commodities and eliminated anyone who threatened their operation." Dr. Foster nodded grimly. "The question now is whether this person acted alone or if there were others involved. The level of organization, the construction of this chamber, the systematic approach. It suggests resources and assistance that one individual might not have possessed." As Chen climbed back up to ground level, her phone buzzed with a text message from Sheriff Martinez. "Found something at the Richardson house. You need to get over here immediately." The investigation was expanding, and Chen had the sinking feeling that what they had discovered beneath Grace Baptist Church was just the beginning of a network of horror that had operated in the Tennessee mountains for years, hidden beneath the facade of a peaceful religious community. The Richardson house sat at the end of a gravel driveway, surrounded by towering pine trees that had grown wild and unkempt in the 26 years since its last occupants vanished. Detective Chen pulled up behind Sheriff Frank Martinez's patrol car, noting how the once white farmhouse had weathered to a dull gray, its shutters hanging at odd angles, and its front porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Martinez emerged from the house as Chen approached, his weathered face grim with the weight of new discoveries. At 62, he had been a rookie deputy when Pastor Richardson and Hannah disappeared, and the unsolved case had haunted his entire career in law enforcement. "Sarah, I've been in this business for 40 years, and I thought I'd seen everything," Martinez said, removing his hat and running a hand through his thinning gray hair. "But what I found in that basement, it changes everything we thought we knew about David Richardson." Chen followed the sheriff around to the back of the house where a set of concrete steps led down to a basement entrance that had been concealed behind overgrown honeysuckle vines. The wooden door stood open, revealing darkness beyond. The state took possession of this property after Richardson was declared legally dead, Martinez explained as they descended into the basement. It's been empty ever since, but the county's been paying for basic maintenance. Last week, we got a call from a neighbor about vandals possibly breaking in, so I came to check it out. The basement was larger than Chen had expected, running the full length of the house. Martinez led her to the far end, where a section of the concrete wall showed signs of recent disturbance. Someone had broken through what appeared to be a false wall, revealing a hidden room behind it. The vandals weren't just looking for things to steal, Martinez said, shining his flashlight into the concealed space. They were looking for something specific, and I think they found it. Chen peered into the hidden room, which was approximately 8 feet square and lined with metal shelving. Most of the shelves were empty, but scattered across the floor were dozens of manila folders, their contents spilled out in apparent haste. Photographs, documents, and newspaper clippings were strewn everywhere, creating a carpet of evidence that someone had desperately tried to gather and remove. "Frank, this looks like a command center," Chen said, entering the room carefully to avoid disturbing potential evidence. "Look at these wall maps." 3 large maps were still tacked to the walls: Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia. Each map was covered with colored pushpins and connecting strings, creating a complex web of locations and timelines. Red pins marked what appeared to be abduction sites, while blue pins indicated where children's bodies had been discovered. Yellow pins marked locations that were labeled with question marks, suggesting suspected sites that hadn't been confirmed. Pastor Richardson wasn't just investigating missing children, Chen realized, studying the meticulous documentation. He was tracking a network. Look at these patterns. The pins created clear geographical corridors, showing how abductions had occurred along specific routes through the Appalachian region. The victims appeared to have been taken from campgrounds, state parks, and remote rural areas where children might be camping or hiking with their families. Martinez picked up one of the manila folders from the floor, its contents partially scattered. "Sarah, look at this. It's labeled Church Connections." Inside the folder were photographs of various churches throughout the region, along with detailed notes about their pastors, congregation sizes, and proximity to abduction sites. Several churches were circled in red, with notations about confirmed network participants and safe houses. Chen felt her blood run cold as she read through the notes. Pastor Richardson had discovered that multiple churches throughout the region were being used as fronts for a child trafficking network. The isolated locations, the trust that families placed in religious leaders, and the frequent camping and youth activities made churches perfect hunting grounds for predators. "Here's the terrifying part," Martinez said, holding up another folder. "Look at this list of names." The folder contained what appeared to be a roster of network participants, including pastors, church board members, and community leaders from across 3 states. Some names were highlighted in yellow, marked as confirmed perpetrators, while others were noted as unknowing facilitators, or potential assets. Chen's hands trembled as she found a page labeled Grace Baptist Church Internal Assessment. Pastor Richardson had been investigating his own congregation, documenting suspicious behavior and questioning the backgrounds of several church members. One name was circled multiple times in red ink: Thomas Brennan, Maintenance Supervisor. Investigate construction skills and property access. "Frank, we need to find out what happened to Thomas Brennan," Chen said urgently. "And we need to determine who broke into this house and what they took." Martinez nodded, photographing each document with his phone. "There's something else, Sarah. Look at this." He handed her a spiral notebook that had been hidden beneath a pile of photographs. The cover was labeled Insurance Policy in Pastor Richardson's handwriting. Inside, Richardson had documented his own investigation methods, including details about how he had been secretly recording conversations and gathering evidence. The final entry, dated September 18, 1981, read, "Network aware of investigation. Brennan asked too many questions about church schedules. Hannah in immediate danger. Have contacted FBI field office in Nashville. Agent Morrison scheduled to meet Sunday evening after service. Hiding evidence copies in multiple locations. If something happens to us, Dorothy Fleming has instructions." Chen looked up at Martinez, understanding dawning in her eyes. Dorothy Fleming, the woman I interviewed this morning. She's been sitting on evidence for 26 years. And whoever broke into this house, Martinez added grimly, knows that we're getting close to exposing a network that's been operating for decades. The question is, are they still active, and how far will they go to protect themselves? As they prepared to leave the hidden room, Chen noticed something that made her stomach turn. On the wall beside the maps was a schedule, written in Pastor Richardson's careful handwriting, showing church service times, youth group meetings, and community events for dozens of churches throughout the region. Someone had been using this information to target children at their most vulnerable moments, turning places of worship into hunting grounds. The investigation was no longer just about solving a 26-year-old disappearance. They were unraveling a systematic network of predators who had been hiding behind religious facades, and the evidence suggested that Pastor Richardson and Hannah had died because they had gotten too close to exposing the truth. Detective Chen drove through the winding mountain roads back to Dorothy Fleming's house as the afternoon sun cast long shadows through the pine trees. The urgency of Pastor Richardson's final journal entry weighed heavily on her mind. Dorothy Fleming had been entrusted with information that could expose a decades-old network of predators, and she had kept that secret for 26 years. When Chen knocked on Dorothy's front door the second time that day, the elderly woman's face showed no surprise, only a weary resignation that suggested she had been expecting this moment for a very long time. "You found David's room, didn't you?" Dorothy said quietly, stepping aside to allow Chen into her modest living room. "I've been waiting for this day since 1981, Detective. Waiting and praying that someone would finally uncover the truth." Chen settled into the same chair she had occupied that morning, but now the atmosphere felt entirely different. The cozy kitchen that had seemed like a sanctuary for shared memories now felt charged with the weight of long-buried secrets. "Mrs. Fleming, Pastor Richardson's notes indicate that he gave you specific instructions. We need to know what you've been protecting all these years." Dorothy walked to an old cedar chest that sat beneath her living room window. With trembling hands, she opened the lid and removed a manila envelope that looked identical to the one scattered across the hidden room in Richardson's basement. "David came to my house the Saturday before he disappeared," Dorothy began, her voice steady despite the tears forming in her eyes. "He was terrified, Detective Chen. I'd never seen that man afraid of anything, but that night he was shaking like a leaf." She handed the envelope to Chen, who opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be a detailed map of the church property with specific areas marked in red ink. "He told me that if anything happened to him and Hannah, I was to wait until law enforcement discovered evidence at the church itself. He said the authorities in 1981 wouldn't believe what he had uncovered, but someday when the physical evidence was found, someone would take it seriously." Chen studied the documents, recognizing many of them as copies of materials from Richardson's hidden room. But there were additional items that hadn't been in the basement: audio cassette tapes labeled with dates and names, and a letter addressed to FBI Agent Morrison, Nashville Field Office. "Mrs. Fleming, did Pastor Richardson ever meet with this FBI agent?" Dorothy shook her head sadly. "The meeting was supposed to happen after evening service that Sunday. Agent Morrison was going to drive up from Nashville, and David was going to turn over all his evidence. But David and Hannah disappeared that very night, and the FBI agent never came forward during the investigation." Chen made a note to contact the Nashville FBI field office to verify whether Agent Morrison had existed and what had happened to prevent the meeting. The implications were troubling. Either the agent had never received Richardson's message, or something had prevented him from responding to what should have been a high-priority case. "Tell me about these audio tapes," Chen said, examining the cassettes. Each was labeled with a date and location: August 15, 1981, Brennan Conversation; September 2, 1981, Church Board Meeting, and several others. "David had been secretly recording conversations for months," Dorothy explained. "He suspected that someone in the church leadership was involved with the disappearances, but he needed proof. Those tapes contain admissions, Detective. Conversations about acquiring subjects and maintaining operational security." Chen felt her pulse quicken. If these recordings contained evidence of conspiracy, they could be the key to identifying current members of the network who might still be active. Mrs. Fleming, I need you to come with me to the sheriff's office. We're going to need your full statement and we'll need to secure these materials as evidence. As they prepared to leave, Dorothy grabbed Chen's arm with surprising strength. Detective, David's last words to me were about Hannah. He said she was the key to everything, that protecting her was more important than exposing the network. I never understood what he meant, but I think he knew they were going to take her. The drive to the sheriff's office felt surreal, as Chen processed everything Dorothy had revealed. Pastor Richardson hadn't just stumbled onto a child trafficking network. He had conducted a systematic investigation, gathered evidence, and prepared multiple safeguards to ensure the truth would survive, even if he didn't. But as they descended into the valley where the sheriff's office was located, Chen noticed a vehicle following them at a distance, maintaining the same speed and making the same turns. The network that had silenced Pastor Richardson 26 years ago was still out there, and they had just announced their presence by accessing his hidden room. The question now was whether Chen and her team could move fast enough to expose the truth before the network silenced them too. Detective Chen's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as she watched the dark SUV in her rearview mirror maintain its careful distance behind them. Dorothy Fleming sat in the passenger seat, clutching the manila envelope to her chest, occasionally glancing back with the nervous energy of someone who had lived in fear for decades. Mrs. Fleming, how well do you know Thomas Brennan? Chen asked, trying to keep her voice casual while monitoring the vehicle behind them. Tommy? Dorothy's voice carried a mixture of surprise and concern. He's been the church maintenance supervisor since before David disappeared. Sweet man, always willing to help with repairs around people's homes. Why do you ask? Chen considered how much to reveal. His name appeared in Pastor Richardson's investigation notes. We need to speak with him. Well, you'll find him at the church most days, Dorothy replied. He lives in that little trailer behind the fellowship hall. Never married, keeps to himself mostly, but he's been devoted to Grace Baptist for 30 years. The irony wasn't lost on Chen. If Brennan had been involved in the network, he had been living and working at the very site where his victims were buried, maintaining the grounds above their remains for over 2 decades. The psychological profile of someone who could do that sent chills through her. As they approached the sheriff's office, Chen made a sudden decision. Instead of pulling into the parking lot, she continued straight, watching as the SUV behind them hesitated at the intersection. Before following, whoever was tailing them wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. Detective, weren't we going to the sheriff's office? Dorothy asked, confused. Change of plans, Chen replied, pulling out her phone and dialing Martinez. Frank, I'm being followed. Dark SUV, Tennessee plates. I'm heading toward the church with Mrs. Fleming. We need backup and we need to locate Thomas Brennan immediately. Martinez's voice was tense. Sarah, get out of there. Bring Mrs. Fleming to the office and we'll handle Brennan. Too late for that, Chen replied, watching the SUV accelerate behind them. They're not trying to hide anymore. This is happening now. Chen made a sharp right turn onto the winding road that led back toward Grace Baptist Church, her mind racing through possibilities. If the network was moving openly, it meant they felt cornered and desperate. Desperate people made dangerous decisions. The church property appeared ahead, yellow crime scene tape still fluttering around the excavation site. Chen parked near the forensic van that remained on scene, hoping the presence of state investigators would deter any immediate threat. The SUV pulled over about 100 yards away, its occupants remaining inside but clearly visible. Mrs. Fleming, I want you to stay in the car and keep your doors locked, Chen instructed, drawing her service weapon and checking her radio. If anything happens, you call 911 and tell them an officer needs assistance at Grace Baptist Church. Chen approached the church building cautiously, noting that Brennan's trailer behind the fellowship hall showed signs of recent activity. A truck was parked beside it, and lights were on inside despite the late afternoon hour. Smoke was rising from a barrel beside the trailer, suggesting someone was burning something. The trailer door opened as Chen approached, and a man in his 60s emerged. Thomas Brennan was smaller than Chen had expected, with graying hair and the calloused hands of someone who had spent decades doing manual labor. But his eyes held an alertness that suggested he was far from the simple maintenance worker he appeared to be. "Detective Chen, I presume," Brennan said calmly, his voice carrying a slight Appalachian accent. "I've been expecting you." "Mr. Brennan, I'd like to ask you some questions about Pastor Richardson and the events of 1981. Brennan gestured toward the burning barrel, where Chen could see the edges of photographs and documents being consumed by flames. "I figured this day would come eventually. David was always too smart for his own good, too determined to play hero." The casual admission sent adrenaline coursing through Chen's system. "Are you confessing to involvement in Pastor Richardson's disappearance?" "Involvement?" Brennan laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Detective, I built that chamber under the church with my own hands. I wrapped those bodies in plastic and arranged them just the way the others wanted. Pastor David Richardson died because he couldn't leave well enough alone." Chen keyed her radio requesting immediate backup, but Brennan shook his head sadly. "Your radio won't work out here, Detective. We've got signal jammers running. Been using them for years to keep nosy folks from calling for help when they stumbled onto things they shouldn't have seen." From her peripheral vision, Chen could see movement near the church. Additional figures were emerging from the surrounding woods, and she realized she had walked into a carefully orchestrated trap. The network hadn't just been monitoring the investigation, they had been preparing for this moment. "How many children, Mr. Brennan?" Chen asked, backing slowly toward her car while keeping her weapon trained on him. "Lost count after the first dozen," Brennan replied matter-of-factly. "But David had figured out most of it. That's why we had to stop him. Hannah was just insurance. Made sure he wouldn't cause any more trouble." Chen's blood ran cold. "Hannah's still alive?" Brennan's expression shifted, becoming almost paternal. "Oh, Detective Chen. Hannah Richardson grew up to be a fine young woman. Learned to keep quiet, learned to be useful. In fact, I believe you've already met her." The realization hit Chen like a physical blow. Someone she had encountered during the investigation wasn't who they claimed to be. Someone had been feeding information to the network about her progress. Someone who had been close enough to monitor her movements and anticipate her discoveries. "Where is she?" Chen demanded, her voice steady despite the chaos of thoughts racing through her mind. "Closer than you think," Brennan replied, glancing toward the woods where more figures continued to emerge. "Hannah's been watching over you since this investigation began, making sure you found exactly what we wanted you to find, when we wanted you to find it." Chen began to understand the horrifying truth. The discovery of the bodies beneath the church hadn't been accidental. The construction crew hadn't stumbled onto evidence by chance. The network had orchestrated the entire revelation, controlling the investigation from the beginning. "Why?" Chen asked, still backing toward her car. "Why? Reveal the evidence now?" "Because, Detective, after 26 years, it's time for a changing of the guard. The old generation is ready to retire, and we need someone new to take the blame for all those old crimes. Someone who stumbled onto a cold case and got too close to the truth for her own good." Chen reached her car, where Dorothy Fleming sat, wide-eyed in the passenger seat. But as Chen opened the driver's door, she realized with growing horror that the elderly woman's expression wasn't one of fear. It was one of sad resignation, as if she had been expecting this moment as well. "I'm sorry, Detective," Dorothy whispered, her voice barely audible. "They have my grandson. They've had him for 3 years. They said if I helped them, if I played my part properly, they'd let him come home." The trap was complete. Chen was surrounded by members of a network that had been planning this moment for months, possibly years. And somewhere among them was Hannah Richardson, the 7-year-old victim who had become something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Detective Chen's mind raced as she tried to process the horrifying reality of her situation. Surrounded by members of a network that had operated for decades, with her radio jammed and backup unaware of her location, she found herself facing the kind of calculated evil that defied comprehension. But it was Dorothy Fleming's betrayal that cut the deepest. The realization that even the elderly woman's grief had been weaponized against her. Detective Chen, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, came a familiar voice from behind her. Chen turned slowly, her service weapon still drawn but feeling increasingly useless as more figures emerged from the tree line. The voice belonged to Dr. Amanda Foster, the state forensic pathologist who had been examining the remains found beneath the church. Dr. Foster? Chen's voice carried disbelief and growing understanding. You're part of this. I've been part of this since before you were born, Detective, Dr. Foster replied calmly, her professional demeanor now taking on a sinister quality. Someone had to make sure that evidence was interpreted correctly, that investigations went in the right directions, that certain conclusions were reached while others were avoided. The implications were staggering. For years, possibly decades, the network had maintained control by placing their people in positions of authority within the very systems meant to protect children and investigate crimes. Chen realized that countless cases might have been deliberately mishandled or buried. Where's Hannah Richardson? Chen demanded, keeping her weapon trained on the growing circle of people surrounding her car. Right here, Detective. The voice that answered was young, female, and came from directly behind Chen. She turned to see a woman in her early 30s approaching from the direction of the church. Someone Chen recognized but had never suspected was the forensic technician who had been working the excavation site. The quiet woman in coveralls who had been carefully documenting the crime scene for the past 2. Detective Chen's mind raced as she tried to process the horrifying reality of her situation, surrounded by members of a network that had operated for decades. With her radio jammed and backup unaware of her location, she found herself facing the kind of calculated evil that defied comprehension. But it was Dorothy Fleming's betrayal that cut the deepest. The realization that even the elderly woman's grief had been weaponized against her. Detective Chen, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be, came a familiar voice from behind her. Chen turned slowly, her service weapon still drawn, but feeling increasingly useless as more figures emerged from the tree line. The voice belonged to Dr. Amanda Foster, the state forensic pathologist who had been examining the remains found beneath the church. Dr. Foster? Chen's voice carried disbelief and growing understanding. You're part of this. I've been part of this since before you were born, Detective, Dr. Foster replied calmly, her professional demeanor now taking on a sinister quality. Someone had to make sure that evidence was interpreted correctly, that investigations went in the right directions, that certain conclusions were reached while others were avoided. The implications were staggering. For years, possibly decades, the network had maintained control by placing their people in positions of authority within the very systems meant to protect children and investigate crimes. Chen realized that countless cases might have been deliberately mishandled or buried. Where's Hannah Richardson? Chen demanded, keeping her weapon trained on the growing circle of people surrounding her car. Right here, Detective. The voice that answered was young, female, and came from directly behind Chen. She turned to see a woman in her early 30s approaching from the direction of the church. Someone Chen recognized but had never suspected was the forensic technician who had been working the excavation site, the quiet woman in coveralls who had been carefully documenting the crime scene for the past 2 days. The woman Chen had assumed was just another state employee doing her job. My name is Hannah Richardson, the woman said, her voice carrying an odd mixture of sadness and resignation. Though I haven't used that name in 26 years. Chen stared at the face before her, trying to reconcile the 7-year-old victim from the missing persons photos with the adult woman who stood before her. Hannah had grown into a petite woman with dark hair and the kind of unremarkable features that would allow her to blend into any crowd. They took me that night, Hannah continued, her eyes holding depths of trauma that spoke to decades of psychological manipulation. But they didn't kill me like they killed my father. They had other plans for me. What kind of plans? Chen asked, though she dreaded the answer. They needed someone on the inside, Hannah explained, her voice flat and emotionless. Someone who could be trained from childhood to understand their methods, to help them stay ahead of investigations, to make sure evidence was handled properly. They gave me a new identity, sent me to college, helped me get my job with the state forensics lab. The horror of it was overwhelming. Hannah Richardson hadn't just been a victim. She had been groomed from the age of 7 to become an accomplice in the very network that had murdered her father and countless other children. "Hannah, you can still choose to help us stop this," Chen said desperately. "You can honor your father's memory by finishing what he started." Hannah's expression flickered for a moment, showing a glimpse of the traumatized child she had once been. But then her face hardened again, and Chen saw the result of decades of psychological conditioning. "My father is dead because he couldn't accept that some things are bigger than individual conscience," Hannah replied. "The network isn't evil, Detective Chen. It's efficient. It provides services to people who have needs that society won't acknowledge. And it maintains order in a chaotic world." Chen realized she was listening to the voice of someone who had been so thoroughly broken and rebuilt that she genuinely believed the twisted logic that had been drilled into her for decades. Hannah Richardson wasn't just a victim. She was a product of systematic psychological abuse that had turned her into an advocate for her own captors. The plan was always to eventually reveal some of the old evidence, Dr. Foster explained, stepping closer to Chen's car. "Public pressure requires occasional sacrifices. A few old bones, a cold case solved, a corrupt detective who got too close to the truth and had to be eliminated. It satisfies the public's need for justice while protecting the larger operation." "But why now?" Chen asked, still trying to understand the timeline. "Because I'm retiring," Thomas Brennan said with a grin. 30 years of maintenance work. 30 years of keeping secrets buried. I've earned my retirement, but the network needs someone to take responsibility for all those old disappearances. Chen began to understand the full scope of their plan. They were going to kill her and frame her posthumously for decades of child abductions and murders. The evidence they had allowed her to discover would be reinterpreted as proof that she had been the predator all along, investigating her own crimes to stay ahead of detection. "Detective," Hannah said, approaching Chen's car with something in her hand. "This won't hurt. We're not monsters. The injection will be quick, and then we'll arrange everything to look like you couldn't live with the guilt of your crimes finally being exposed." Chen saw the syringe in Hannah's hand and realized her time was running out. Dorothy Fleming sat frozen in the passenger seat, tears streaming down her face but making no move to help. The elderly woman had chosen her grandson's life over Chen's, and Chen couldn't even blame her for it. "Hannah, your father was a hero," Chen said desperately, backing against her car. "He died trying to protect children like you. Don't let his sacrifice be meaningless." For just a moment, Hannah hesitated. Something flickered in her eyes, a shadow of the 7-year-old girl who had watched her father deliver his final sermon. But then Dr. Foster placed a hand on Hannah's shoulder, and the moment passed. "Hannah knows her duty," Dr. Foster said firmly, "just as she's known it every day for the past 26 years. As Hannah moved closer with the syringe, Chen made a desperate calculation. Her radio might be jammed, but her phone might still have GPS tracking that could lead Martinez to her location. If she could buy enough time, create enough noise, maybe, there was still a chance. Chen raised her weapon not at Hannah but at the burning barrel where Brennan had been destroying evidence. A single shot rang out across the church grounds, the bullet striking the metal barrel and sending burning documents scattering across the dry grass. In the chaos that followed, as Brennan and the others scrambled to contain the spreading fire, Chen grabbed Dorothy Fleming and ran toward the church building, hoping that the sacred ground where this nightmare had begun might somehow provide sanctuary from the evil that had taken root beneath it. Detective Chen dragged Dorothy Fleming through the front doors of Grace Baptist Church as shouts erupted from the chaos outside. The burning documents had ignited the dry grass, creating enough distraction for them to reach the sanctuary, but Chen knew their refuge would be temporary at best. Inside the church, late afternoon sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across wooden pews that had witnessed decades of worship. Unaware of the horrors buried beneath their feet, Chen quickly scanned the interior, looking for anything that might help them survive the next few minutes. "Detective, I'm so sorry," Dorothy gasped, her elderly frame shaking with exhaustion and guilt. "They have my grandson Tyler. He's only 14. They showed me pictures of what they'd do to him if I didn't cooperate." Chen helped Dorothy into one of the pews, her mind racing through possibilities. The church had no rear exit, no cell phone signal, and they were surrounded by people who had spent decades perfecting the art of making problems disappear. Mrs. Fleming, those audio tapes that Pastor Richardson made, are they real? Every single one, Dorothy replied firmly. David was meticulous. He recorded board meetings, private conversations, even phone calls. Everything's on those tapes. Chen pulled out the cassette player she had grabbed from Dorothy's evidence envelope during their escape. If they were going to die in this church, at least the truth would be spoken aloud in the place where Pastor Richardson had delivered his final sermon. She inserted the first tape labeled September 2nd, 1981, church board meeting, and pressed play. Thomas Brennan's voice filled the sanctuary, younger but unmistakably his. The Richardson problem needs permanent resolution, Brennan's recorded voice said. He's got documentation on 12 acquisition sites across 3 states. If this gets to federal authorities, the entire southern network collapses. Another voice responded, one that made Dorothy gasp in recognition. Dr. Foster was even involved back then, she whispered. The disposal method we used in Kentucky worked perfectly. Dr. Foster's younger voice continued on the tape. No evidence, no investigation. We can replicate that here if necessary. The church doors burst open as Chen reached for the second tape. Hannah Richardson entered first, no longer carrying the syringe but now holding a pistol with practiced familiarity. Behind her came Dr. Foster, Brennan, and 3 other figures Chen didn't recognize. Detective Chen, you're only making this harder on yourself, Hannah called out, her voice echoing in the sacred space. And on Mrs. Fleming's grandson. Chen stood in front of the pew where Dorothy sat, shielding the elderly woman with her own body. Hannah, your father's voice is about to fill this church, the same voice you heard during Sunday services when you were 7 years old. Are you really going to commit murder in the place where he preached about love and forgiveness? Hannah's gun wavered slightly as Chen pressed play on the second tape. Pastor David Richardson's voice emerged from the small speaker, reading from scripture during what must have been one of his final sermons. The truth will set you free, Pastor Richardson's recorded voice proclaimed, the words carrying across the sanctuary with gentle authority. Though evil may prosper for a season, righteousness will ultimately prevail. Chen watched Hannah's face as her father's voice continued, noting the tears that began forming in the young woman's eyes. Somewhere beneath decades of conditioning and trauma, the 7-year-old daughter who had loved her father was still fighting to survive. Hannah, Chen said softly, this is your chance to honor your father's memory. Help me finish what he started. For a moment, the sanctuary fell silent, except for Pastor Richardson's recorded voice speaking about courage in the face of evil. Hannah's gun slowly lowered as she stared at the altar where her father had once stood. But before she could make her choice, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the mountain air, growing louder by the second. The wailing sirens grew louder, as Sheriff Martinez's voice boomed through a megaphone outside Grace Baptist Church. This is the sheriff's department. The building is surrounded. Exit with your hands visible. Dr. Foster's composure cracked for the first time since Chen had known her. How did they find us so quickly? She demanded, turning on Brennan with fury in her eyes. The detective's phone, Hannah said quietly, still staring at the cassette player where her father's voice had fallen silent. GPS tracking. I should have made her leave it in the car. Chen seized on the moment of confusion. Hannah, you let them find us. Some part of you wanted this to end. Thomas Brennan raised his own weapon, pointing it directly at Chen. Doesn't matter now. We finish this here, blame it on a hostage situation gone wrong. The network survives. But Hannah stepped between Brennan and Chen, her gun now aimed at the maintenance supervisor who had helped destroy her childhood. No, more children die because of you, Tommy. Hannah, what are you doing? Dr. Foster's voice carried the sharp edge of someone losing control of a carefully orchestrated plan. You know what happens if the network falls. Think about all the people who depend on us. I've been thinking about them for 26 years, Hannah replied, her voice growing stronger. I've been thinking about every child who disappeared, while I helped you cover your tracks. I've been thinking about my father who died trying to save children like me. Chen watched the standoff unfold, realizing that Hannah Richardson was finally fighting the programming that had controlled her since childhood. The 7-year-old girl who had sat in the front pew listening to her father's sermons was breaking, free from decades of psychological manipulation. "Detective Chen," Hannah said without taking her eyes off Brennan, "there's something you need to know about the safety deposit box in Knoxville. My father didn't just hide evidence there. He hid." Chen felt confusion wash over her. "What do you mean?" "The night before we disappeared, my father made a video recording. He knew they were coming for us, so he documented everything he had discovered. Names, locations, methods. He wanted to make sure that someday, someone would understand the full scope of what they were dealing with." Dr. Foster made a move toward her own weapon, but Hannah's training was evident as she smoothly shifted her aim. "Don't, Amanda. You taught me too well." Outside, Chen could hear Sheriff Martinez coordinating with what sounded like multiple agencies. The cavalry had arrived, but the most important battle was happening inside the sanctuary, where a traumatized child was finally finding her voice. "Hannah," Chen said gently, "we can end this now. Help me make sure your father's sacrifice wasn't in vain." "The video is in the safety deposit box," Hannah continued, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks, "along with a complete list of network members across 6 states. Politicians, law enforcement, clergy, medical professionals. People who used their positions of trust to hurt children." Brennan's face had gone pale as he realized the full implications. "You little bitch. Do you have any idea how many people you're destroying?" "People who deserve to be destroyed," Hannah shot back, her father's moral courage finally breaking through decades of conditioning. The church doors opened slowly as tactical officers began entering, their weapons drawn but held low as they assessed the situation. Sheriff Martinez followed, his eyes taking in the scene with practiced calm. "Dr. Foster, Mr. Brennan, drop your weapons," Martinez commanded. "This ends now." As the 2 older conspirators reluctantly complied, Hannah Richardson turned to face the altar where her father had once preached. For the first time in 26 years, she was truly free. 3 days after the confrontation at Grace Baptist Church, Detective Chen sat in a secure conference room at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Nashville, surrounded by federal agents, state prosecutors, and evidence that painted a picture of systematic evil, spanning multiple decades. The safety deposit box in Knoxville had yielded Pastor David Richardson's final testament, a 2-hour video recording that methodically documented one of the largest child trafficking networks in American history. On the conference table lay printouts of the network's organizational chart, a horrifying web of connections that reached into churches, schools, law enforcement agencies, and government offices across 6 states. Names that Chen recognized from newspaper headlines and community leadership positions were circled in red, marking them as confirmed predators who had used their authority to facilitate unspeakable crimes. "The Richardson video is devastating," said FBI Special Agent Morrison, the same agent who had been scheduled to meet with Pastor Richardson 26 years earlier. "He documented everything: recruitment methods, transportation routes, safe houses, financial structures. This man was conducting a federal investigation better than most of our own agents." Chen studied the organizational chart, noting how the network had operated like a sophisticated business enterprise. Churches served as recruitment centers, identifying vulnerable children through youth programs and community outreach. Medical professionals like Dr. Foster provided examinations that were actually assessments for trafficking potential. Law enforcement contacts ensured that investigations were misdirected or abandoned. "What about Dorothy Fleming's grandson?" Chen asked, remembering the elderly woman's terrified confession about her coerced cooperation. "Tyler Fleming was recovered from a facility in Kentucky yesterday," Agent Morrison replied. "He's alive, physically unharmed, but he'll need extensive psychological support. Mrs. Fleming is being treated as a victim, not a conspirator. She was under duress for 3 years." Hannah Richardson entered the conference room, no longer the broken woman who had been programmed by her captors but still carrying the weight of decades of trauma. She had spent the past 3 days providing detailed testimony about the network's operations, her insider knowledge proving invaluable to investigators. The network operated on a cellular structure, Hannah explained, taking a seat across from Chen. Individual groups were isolated from each other, so if one cell was compromised, the others could continue operating. That's why my father's investigation was so dangerous. He was mapping connections that even most network members didn't understand. Agent Morrison nodded. Thanks to Hannah's testimony and her father's evidence, we've initiated coordinated raids across 6 states this morning. 47 arrests so far, with more pending as we analyze financial records and communication intercepts. Chen felt a mixture of satisfaction and sorrow as she watched news reports on the conference room television. Respected community leaders were being led away in handcuffs, their carefully constructed facades finally crumbling. But for every arrest, there were victims whose trauma could never be fully healed. There's something else, Hannah said quietly. The network kept detailed records of every child they took, not just for operational purposes, but because the leadership was obsessed with documentation. They filmed everything. The implications were staggering. Somewhere in the seized evidence were recordings that could provide closure to families who had spent decades wondering what had happened to their children. Hannah, Chen said gently, what you've done these past 3 days helping us understand how the network operated, it's what your father would have wanted. You've honored his memory. Hannah's eyes filled with tears, but for the first time since Chen had known her, they were tears of relief rather than fear. He used to tell me that truth always finds a way to surface even when evil tries to bury it. I never believed him until now. Agent Morrison stood, gathering the files spread across the table. This investigation will continue for months, possibly years. But because of Pastor Richardson's courage and Hannah's testimony, we've broken something that has destroyed countless lives. That matters. As the meeting concluded, Chen realized that the horror beneath Grace Baptist Church had finally served its purpose, not as a monument to evil, but as evidence that even the darkest secrets couldn't remain hidden forever when brave people were willing to speak the truth. 6 months after the arrests that dismantled the child trafficking network, Detective Chen stood in the rebuilt sanctuary of Grace Baptist Church, watching as community members gathered for a memorial service unlike any the mountain town had ever witnessed. The underground chamber had been filled with concrete, the altar rebuilt, and the entire building consecrated anew. But today's service wasn't about forgetting the horror that had been hidden beneath sacred ground. It was about honoring those who had fought against it. At the front of the church, a simple memorial wall displayed photographs of Pastor David Richardson and the 17 children whose remains had been identified through DNA analysis and network records. Each photograph was accompanied by a white lily and a brief description of the child's life before they had been stolen from their families. Hannah Richardson sat in the front pew, the same place where she had sat as a 7-year-old listening to her father's sermons. Now 33 years old and undergoing intensive therapy, she had chosen to reclaim her original name and identity. Beside her sat Dorothy Fleming, whose courage in preserving her pastor's evidence had made justice possible, and Tyler Fleming, her grandson who had survived his captivity and was slowly healing with professional support. Sheriff Martinez took the podium first, his weathered face showing the weight of decades spent wondering about the case that had haunted his career. 26 years ago, this community lost a man who exemplified everything we hope to find in our spiritual leaders. Pastor David Richardson died because he refused to ignore evil when he encountered it. The sheriff's voice carried across the packed sanctuary, reaching family members who had traveled from across the country to attend the service. Parents who had never stopped searching for missing children, siblings who had carried guilt for decades, grandparents who had died without knowing what happened to their loved ones, represented now by the next generation seeking closure. Chen watched from the back of the church as Martinez continued. The investigation that followed Pastor Richardson's evidence has led to convictions in over 60 cases spanning 3 decades. But more importantly, it has brought home 12 children who were still being held captive by the network. The rescued children, now adults, were slowly rebuilding their lives with extensive support services. Some, like Hannah, had been so thoroughly programmed that recovery would take years. Others had maintained enough psychological resilience to begin healing more quickly. All of them carried scars that would never fully disappear. Hannah rose to approached the podium, her steps uncertain but determined. When she spoke, her voice carried the same gentle authority that had once characterized her father's sermons. "My father believed that truth has its own power," she began, looking out at the congregation that included many faces from her childhood. "He died protecting that truth, and for 26 years, I forgot who I was supposed to be. But standing here today, I remember." She paused, gathering strength from somewhere deep within her recovering spirit. "The evil that operated in this place tried to convince me that darkness was stronger than light, that fear was more powerful than love. They were wrong. My father's truth survived. Your love for the missing children never died. And somehow, miraculously, enough of us survived to tell the story." Chen felt tears forming in her eyes as Hannah continued, her words becoming a bridge between the traumatized child she had been and the healing woman she was becoming. "I want every family here to know that your children fought. They didn't give up hope, even in their darkest moments. And I want every parent who worried that they should have done more to protect their child to know that evil this sophisticated couldn't have been stopped by individual vigilance. It took all of us, working together to bring it down." As Hannah returned to her seat, Chen realized that Grace Baptist Church had truly become what Pastor David Richardson had always intended it to be. A place where truth triumphed over deception, where light conquered darkness, and where a community could heal from even the deepest wounds. 1 year after the memorial service, Detective Chen drove through the Tennessee mountains on a crisp autumn morning, returning to Grace Baptist Church for a very different kind of gathering. The church had been transformed once again, this time into something Pastor David Richardson could never have imagined, but would certainly have approved of. A training center for law enforcement agencies, learning to identify and investigate child trafficking networks. The parking lot was filled with vehicles bearing license plates from across the Southeast. FBI agents, state investigators, social workers, and local sheriff's deputies had gathered for a week-long conference on combating organized child exploitation. The horrors uncovered beneath the church's foundation had become a case study in how predators could hide within trusted institutions and how communities could be systematically deceived for decades. Chen entered the renovated sanctuary, where Hannah Richardson stood at the podium addressing an audience of law enforcement professionals. The transformation in Hannah was remarkable. Therapy and purpose had restored much of her natural confidence, and she had found her calling as an advocate for trafficking survivors. The network operated successfully for 30 years because they understood something that law enforcement often missed. Hannah was explaining to the attentive audience. Predators don't look like monsters. They look like pillars of the community. They volunteer at schools, serve on church boards, and donate to children's charities. They cultivate trust specifically so they can betray it. Chen took a seat in the back, remembering her first visit to this church when she had been focused on solving a cold case. Now she understood that they had uncovered something far more significant. A blueprint for recognizing and dismantling networks that continued to operate across the country. After Hannah's presentation, Chen approached her in the fellowship hall where participants were networking over coffee and sharing intelligence about ongoing investigations. "How are you doing, Hannah?" Chen asked, noting the genuine smile that had replaced the hollow expression she remembered from their first meetings. "Some days are harder than others," Hannah replied honestly. "But I've found something my father taught me in his sermons. Healing isn't about forgetting the past, it's about transforming it into something useful for the future." Hannah gestured toward a group of young adults gathered around Tyler Fleming, who was now 19 and studying criminal justice in college. Tyler and some of the other survivors have started a peer support network. They're helping newly rescued victims understand that recovery is possible. Chen watched Tyler speaking with quiet authority to a younger teenager, clearly drawing on his own experience to provide hope and guidance. The sight reminded her that even the darkest chapters could give birth to unexpected redemption. "Detective Chen," Hannah continued, "I wanted you to know that we've received approval to establish a permanent foundation in my father's name. The David Richardson Foundation will provide training for law enforcement, support for survivors, and resources for families of missing children. As Chen prepared to leave the conference, she paused at the memorial wall that now included photographs of all the survivors alongside those who had been lost. The faces of the living served as testimony that evil, no matter how sophisticated or long-lasting, could not ultimately triumph over human resilience and the power of truth. Outside the church, Chen noticed something that would have made Pastor Richardson proud. Children from the community were playing safely in a new playground that had been built where the old excavation site once stood. Their laughter echoed across the grounds, a sound of innocence reclaimed and hope restored. The investigation that had begun with the discovery of remains beneath sacred ground had evolved into something larger, a movement to protect the vulnerable and ensure that the sacrifices of Pastor David Richardson and the children who died would continue to save lives for generations to come. As Chen drove away from Grace Baptist Church for what she knew would be the last time, she carried with her the knowledge that sometimes justice comes not through punishment alone, but through the transformation of tragedy into a force for protecting others. The truth that Pastor Richardson had died to preserve was now living, breathing, and working to ensure that no child would suffer in silence again.